Hi, I'm Lou Eisen, writer, boxing historian, or I should say boxing writer, boxing historian, and pleased as punch to welcome a real mensch to our show today, Christopher LaForce, who wrote this fantastic book, The Choynski Chronicles, which to me was more than a book, it became a friend, and I was saddened when it ended. It's a big book, but it's a wonderful book. It's got great photos. It's got Choynski's whole story. It's really evocative of the era in which Choynski fought, and it's got brilliant sketches that Chris did himself. And Chris is currently working on a book about the magnificent Tommy Ryan, former undisputed welterweight, middleweight champion. And it's just a real pleasure to have someone on I've been wanting to have on for a long time. Please help me welcome Mr. Chris LaForce here to our humble show. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, sir. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you having me on today, and I look forward to it.
Oh, thank you. Me too. And so does everyone else. I love the book. My first question is, why Choynski? What got you interested in Choynski? And how many times have you had to listen to people say Joe Choynski and roll your eyes?
I think he has the most mispronounced name of any, significant fighter in history, in my opinion.
Right.
And for a lot of reasons, but and I can go into that, how many times I've heard it mispronounced, misspelled. It's ridiculous. But to answer quickly your first question, I got into boxing, I would say around 1973 when I was in, I think, third grade. I saw an issue open in school for some reason on a coffee table, open to pre-fight interviews and such in a Sports Illustrated issue. And it was dealing with the Ali Frazier impending fight of March 8th, 1974, the fight. Mm-hmm. And it said how Frazier had gone to upstate New York to train in a cold camp, and he had the hood on and everything, and, frost all over. And Ali was in Florida training, and just the disparity between the two camps and everything. And I really got into it, but although I love all divisions, I love boxing in general, history, obviously, the heavyweights have specialized in. So with Joe Choynski, even though he wasn't a true heavyweight, and my stance is he was the first light heavyweight champion of the world, not given enough credit for that. I looked at his career, and I saw that at only like 165 to 168 pounds, he took on the most legendary fighters of that first golden age of the heavyweights. He took on guys like, Jim Jeffries, Peter Marr, Bob Fitzsimmons, yada, yada, yada. You can go on and on. Yeah. And not only did he fight him, because any journeyman can fight them all, right? But he did extremely well. Basically, he fought them all to a standstill. He had great results against them. Yeah,
he did. And Jeffries was a monster. I mean, he was gigantic, even for
exactly, especially for his day. But even today, he was big. His height was exaggerated, by the way. They stayed him at 6'2". A prominent anthropometrist had Dr. Dudley Allen Sargent had measured him in Fitzsimmons and most of these guys, so he was only 6 feet 1/2 inch, but he would go up to 225 pounds. Not even walking around a weight. He'd be in shape and condition back then at 225. Wow. He could take a punch to the body and the head like you wouldn't believe, but you would, because But he took some shots that would knock out most fighters, and he just came back and kept coming.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned about the height, because that's one thing you read about. I have a friend in Halifax, Art Hafey, and he was rated above the featherweight champion in the 70s. So Art's 5'2". And people that won't say, I know Art, he's at least 6 feet. And I'll say, no, he's not 6 feet. He's 5'2". He's shorter than me, and I'm short. So boxers tend to project really big. So, and there are guys like Foreman or Ali that were really huge.
6'3", 6'4", yeah.
Yeah, but when you look at
Tyson Fury's not 6'9", by the way. Tyson Fury is 6'7.5" or 6'8".
Okay.
And this is judged by standing beside basketball players and people whose heights have been widely measured. So
right, because I've seen Jeffries listed as 6'3", 6'3.5", and then 6'1" or 6', 6.5". But with Choynski, I've seen it from 5'10" to 6'1". How tall was Choynski?
So Joe generally is his height was measured at 5'10.5", but, and I was just reviewing this again, his in the tail of the tape for various fights like the Jeffries fight, the 20-rounder, he was measured at 5'11.5". So my thing is, in that era, a lot of them were measured in their shoes.
Right. Okay.
So they would add an inch or 3/4 of an inch or half an inch. I would put him at basically 5'11", 5'10.5". He was no giant even then, but of course, neither was John L. Sullivan at 5'10.5". Right. For instance. So, yeah.
It's amazing that when he fought a guy overwhelmingly strong. I mean, when I spoke to Chris Dundee, the promoter, Angela's brother, he said you had to see. He said Jeffries physically may have not been the tallest, but wide. He was just built like a brick house. And
so I have photos of him, and a lot of this is thanks to my friend Tracy Callis, who is a great historian. He did the record on Choynski and Ryan, and I'm adding to it, but drawing heavily from it. It's an awesome base. Put a lot of work into it. I got basically Jeffries highlights in video from him. It's out there now, unbelievable. He was such an athlete. He could run the 10-yard dash in like 10 seconds, essentially.
Yeah.
And he could do backflips. There's video of him just dancing around. He was incredibly quick for his size, which helped a lot. But he was sort of, in a lot of ways, he was like an early Sonny Liston. And I think recently it's come out that Sonny Liston's reach might have been exaggerated at 84 inches. It probably was, but he was a monster. I mean, both men they had different styles, really. Jeffries wasn't as aggressive. He would come at you in a crouch and kind of wait for you to lead and punch to the body with his hellacious left. And another tangent I'll go on real quickly is that Jeffries, along with Joe Frazier, were converted southpaws. I have video. Yeah, I have video of Joe Frazier as an amateur who, like me, it's right jab first, left held back. Yeah.
I knew Frazier. I didn't know Jeffries, though.
Yeah, Jeffries was absolutely a converted southpaw. Now, a lot of people think Liston was too, because Liston's left was better than his right, like the two I just mentioned. In his case, they say that's just not true, that he developed his left when he was young. Unfortunately, he worked in the cotton fields and things like that. And he held a very heavy basket in his left hand while he picked with the right. And they claim, and I have a lot of books on Liston, all the ones out there, I think. And hauling that heavy basket constantly built up his left. And Willie Reddish, his trainer, among others, I'm sure had a lot to do with the development, but his left was stronger than his right. Jeffries' left was stronger, and so was Frazier's, obviously. Yeah, with the legendary Philly left hook.
Yeah, and Liston knocked people out with his jab and knocked their teeth out. I know Chris, and I wasn't going to argue with Chris. I mean, who might argue with Chris Dundee? He's been around since the 20s, and he had posters of Sailor Boy Sonny Liston from 1937-38 fighting. So he said to me, he didn't learn in prison. He learned long before prison. And, but I mean, I don't know. I wasn't, I luckily was young enough and not smart, but smart enough not to talk back and say to Chris.
Sure. Well, experience is not always spot on. Memory, the vagaries of memory. It certainly isn't in my case, but yeah, I don't have early footage of Sonny. I have very early amateur footage of Mike Tyson, a lot of it. Some of the ones I mentioned, George Foreman, by the way, you probably know this, but a lot of people might not. George Foreman when he was still an amateur, got to spar with Sonny Liston a lot.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah. And he said that man, I can punch like the blazes. I could not back that man up. I could barely make him blink with my best punches. So Liston is underrated today.
Oh, without a doubt. I got to tell you, I watched the Jonas Shapoulas fight from the Olympics, and I shouldn't be laughing, but because I watched the George Foreman movie the other night, and I liked it, but when he fights Shapoulas, who was, like all the Russians back then were professional amateurs, right? The guy had been fighting for 14 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. They should have been pros. Yeah.
Yeah, 250.
Classed as pros. They were pros.
Yeah. And so there's Foreman, who's been fighting for maybe 16 to 18 months. And there's this Shapoulas who's looking nice and confident. And the third or fourth jab Foreman lands, knocks out 10 of his teeth. And then a couple seconds later, this is less than a minute into the fight. And the guy's gushing blood. And it's like a horror movie where you go, that's not believable. And this guy, the look on his face, he comes back to his corner and he's like, and years later, Shapoulas said, years after the fight, he was in a traffic accident crossing a street and he got hit head on by a car. He survived, but he said it was like being tickled compared to getting hit by George Foreman. I mean, he said he'd never been hit like that before. No one had ever done that.
George had a power jab for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
He didn't use it enough, unfortunately.
Right, but he did that. Right, early in his career, he didn't.
Yeah.
When you're looking at Choynski, the fight that really people talk about the Barbados Joe Walcott, but I think the more interesting fights when he knocked out Jack Johnson, and you detailed this so brilliantly in your book, because he used a trick, and I'm wondering if he invented it, that's used today, where he exaggerated his hands, a closed guard, a tight guard, and he brought them up deliberately to expose his midsection so Johnson would lean forward with a jab and expose his jaw, and he just switched stances, hit him with a left, and Johnson was out. I mean, he was out for a while.
You have a good memory. He did that in that fight. Of course, this was later than the Jeffries fight. He did it in the Jeffries fight too, and he did it in other fights too. Choynski, as you know, was a very highly intelligent boxer. He was well read. He was very smart outside the ring, intellectual, but he was equally so in the ring. He had brilliant tactics. He would absolutely do that. He would raise his guard. He would invite a body punch, and he had the hand speed and the timing and the anticipation to counter it. And now, in fairness to Johnson and Jeffries in both cases, it was fairly early in their respective careers, so they weren't, nearly as experienced as he was. But he nailed them both with one hellacious punch. It took Johnson out, whose chin was never as good as Jeffries. In Jeffries' case, it sent him spinning and staggering back into the middle of the ring. And of course, what you hear later, like when they talk later in later years in their memoirs, Johnson, Jeffries, Choynski, all of them, Tommy Ryan, all of them, their recollections, of course, are not spot on. Usually there's exaggerations. Right. For one thing, from all of the contemporary primary source accounts, Choynski probably took out Johnson with one right to the head. And and some of them said it didn't look like much, but that's the kind of numbing power he had. And it caught him around the temple area. And Johnson was just, he tried to move a little bit, but he couldn't come close to beating the count. And then, as you know, all hell broke loose. The Texas Rangers stormed in. They had been incognito, dressed in, civilian clothing, and put him in jail, which is a story in itself.
That's a wonderful story, right? Because he taught Johnson how to fight at that point.
Exactly. Now they say, they were in for 30 days, 24, 16 days, whatever. They were actually in for 24 full days, parts of 2 other days. So they were in prison together, 26 days. There are, of course, there are discrepancies about exactly what happened. Joe was taken out apparently by Sheriff Thomas and some others to dinner at night champagne dinners and then brought back at night. And people complained, so that stopped. And they say that Johnson was in his own cell in the basement, treated like crap, of course, bigotry. But then, it shows them together in the same cell, and Joe alludes in one of his memoirs that they were in the same cell. Then he says they weren't. So, but what is true is that Sheriff Thomas and everyone else involved, Schreiber and everyone else, and of course they're in that famous photo,
right,
where Joe and Jack are behind bars and they're looking like really forlorn, and all the others have their rifles in front for posing for posterity and looking bad. Yeah. Well, they got them two pairs of gloves from the local gym, and they let them out into the courtyard during the day, and they let them go at it. They let them spar. And of course, they all loved it. They invited people, civilians, in to watch. Joe showed Jack all kinds of pointers, mostly defensive. And he told him, he says, you're too fast to be taking punches. You should just get out of the way of them. And as I detail in the book, or mention in the book, I said, well, he only, if this is all exactly true, he only took part of his advice because, of course, Johnson became arguably the greatest blocker of punches that ever lived.
Greatest defensive fighter ever.
Yeah. Or he was right up there on the short list. I would put Wilfred Benitez and maybe Willie Pep and a few other guys up there with him, but Johnson was awesome in that respect. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a story. I'm not sure if I read this in your book about, might have been Jeffrey Ward's book, Unforgivable Blackness, where at the end, after his career is over, Johnson, who was always dressed to the nines, walks into a gym, and you've heard this, I'm sure, in Los Angeles, and says to the owner, whom he knows, bring me your best fighter. And the fighter comes, and he says, stand 1.5 feet over here. And Johnson has his arms by his side and said, I'm not going to move my arms, but when I say go, you try to hit me. And he did, and the guy couldn't hit him. And just by moving his hips and his shoulders and rolling with his head, he was able to avoid punches. So it's an amazing skill. And the reason I bring that up, there was a fight last night. I'm not sure if you saw Adam Konaski, probably his last fight. Hopefully it's
I knew he was fighting. I missed it.
Yeah, fighting a guy named Cusimano. And he had Sugar Hill, who's a relative of Emmanuel Stewart. And I know Sugar because when I worked for Leonard Lewis, Leonard's promoted a fight with Adonis Stevenson, who Sugar was training. And he kept saying to Adam, before the fight, he had his hands on his face. And he said, look at me, just listen to me right now. He said, in this fight, you have to move your head. You can't move in a straight line. You got to be moving back and forth. If you keep your head there, you're going to get hurt. And of course, Konaski couldn't do it. He got dropped awkwardly in the first round and then got a pummeling for 7 rounds. And finally, his corner just said, I'm going to stop it. He went out for 1 more round and he got hit 3 or 4 good shots. He was out, and Sugar Hill goes up and he's waving the towel, and the other trainers yelling, and the doctors are yelling, and Harvey Doc lets 17 more punches land on him.
Oh no! And where do they get some of these referees?
I don't know. And you look at it, and the announcers say, "How does this happen?"
It's life and death at that point.
Yeah, the guy's standing in front of Hardy Doc. Stop the fight. It's over. And still he's pounding. Cusimano is pounding away on Konaski.
No, he should have done. He should have pulled a Victor Valley at that point and jumped in like he did with Cooney. You've got to go in the ring, wrap yourself around him, and say, "Get out of here" to the ref. I mean, it's ridiculous. Yeah,
absolutely. Because this has happened before. There's a famous clip of Ike Williams beating up Bo Jack, where Ike Williams turns to the ref and says, "Jesus Christ, do I have to kill the man? I've hit him 20 times in a row. Stop it."
Exactly. Gene Tunney was like that. They say he lacked the killer instinct, but it's humanity.
It is humanity. And it's not like back in the days, the 50s, where that would happen, or in Choynski's time, where a guy could hit a guy a lot like that. And, people think death in boxing is the rarity. It isn't. It's the norm. Unfortunately, but it has happened all through history. Now, I wanted to ask you with Choynski, we have that brief film of him and Jim Jeffries sparring. Was there any film? Were any of his fights filmed, Choynski, or was that the only film of them?
No, unfortunately, that's the only extant footage of him in any kind of anything resembling ring action.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, now they show him like very briefly. I think, yeah, you'll see him very briefly in the video, like in the ring before the Jack Johnson fight, because he was a second, and so you'll see him standing there, and there are stills of it, but that's the only actual video of him in action. And he was almost 42. And I want to mention, as you saw, Joe Choynski at 42 could dance around and move around. He was still so mobile. Mm-hmm. He looks like a Gene Tunney. I'm not going to say an Ali, because Ali had the greatest foot speed of any heavyweight who ever lived, in my opinion. But like a Gene Tunney, a Jim Corbett, guys like that, probably faster on his feet than a Larry Holmes, even, in my opinion. But yeah, he could move, and you can see him fainting constantly, and he just looks really good at almost 42 years old. So
why was he in Jeffrey's corner rather than Johnson? He was friends with Johnson.
He wasn't like really close friends. They were friends, they were on friendly speaking terms. Johnson, unfortunately, in some cases, he was inconsistent too. Sometimes he would deny that Choynski actually knocked him out. He would say, "I've never been knocked out in my life. The hardest punch, though, was by Joe Choynski, and it rattled my brain for a few seconds." But then he admits that, yes, I was knocked out. And sometimes at least once, he didn't even give Choynski credit for teaching him. But most of the time, and later, he said, that month in prison with Joe, he said, taught me how to be a champion. It gave me enough information. Now, obviously, he picked up a lot after that, but he said he gave me the baseline to become a champion. So, yeah.
He was a real scoundrel, Johnson, because although he was not guilty of violating the Mann Act, because the woman he brought across state lines was his wife, although she was a prostitute, Johnson was well known, as you know, for he would skip out in hotel bills, he would skip out in restaurant bills. Guys in England or in the States would book him for a vaudeville tour for 8 weeks and give him, $2,000 a week. So he gets 16 grand. And then after a week, he'd just leave and keep the money. And so
he was notorious in a lot of ways, unfortunately.
Yeah. So,
Good. And you can argue that he set back the cause of black boxers a lot too, because let's face it, when he was up there, he drew the color line against Sam McVeigh, who was the best man at one of his many weddings. Yes. Joe Jeanette, Sam Langford, of course. Yeah. All the great black boxers of the day, and boy, they were great. The fearsome foursome.
He fought them all and beat them.
Yeah, prior to being champion, he knew how good they were. So he said, well, of course, he famously said, two black boys won't draw flies. And then in Paris, of course, he fought battling Jim Johnson. Yeah. A black second-rate heavyweight. Mm-hmm. Jack Johnson broke his arm and probably should have been disqualified in that fight and lost his title, ironically. But it just goes to show that he was somewhat of a hypocrite too. Now the other ones we mentioned, especially Joe Jeanette, what a gentleman and what a great man that guy was. Awesome dude. Yeah.
Yes, and also Langford, who's Canadian. There's a myth, which I'm sure you're well aware of, that people said, he did so well against Johnson. Johnson didn't want to fight him again, but that wasn't true. Johnson had 60, 70 fights. This was only Langford's 20th fight. This was in Boston. And Johnson gave him a hell of a beating, knocked him down 5 or 6 times. And Joe Woodman, Langford's trainer, said after that, years later, said that all the stories about Langford scoring a couple knockdowns and Langford winning a couple rounds, he said it was all false. I planted that so to help Sam out, so his confidence wouldn't be completely destroyed.
Now, to be fair, of course, at the time, Langford was not only less experienced, but it was basically a welterweight against a heavyweight, right. Or today a welterweight against a cruiserweight. So it wasn't at all fair in that sense. But yeah, Langford never knocked him down. Langford even admitted, he said, the only real beating I got was against Jack Johnson. But that said, after Sam had packed on like 30 pounds of muscle and experience. Johnson wanted no part of him anymore, and it would have been a really good fight.
And they had a deal from National Sporting NSC in Britain that if he beat Tommy Burns, he would come back and defend it against Langford, and he never lived up to that. But Johnson rarely lived up to any deals. To me, what's fascinating, of course, is with Langford. Langford was trained by George Budge Byers, who was from Prince Edward Island, Canada's smallest province. And Byers was trained by the original George Godfrey from Canada, who John O'Sullivan refused to fight.
Exactly.
So, and Langford was a very funny guy. There's a very funny story. He was fighting someone. I thought it was Iron Haig in Britain, but it wasn't, because that fight ended early. But he was fighting someone in Britain, and at the 7th or 8th round, he comes out and he touches gloves.
Tiger Smith, I believe.
Right.
Tiger Smith. Yeah.
Yes. You know the story, right? So the guy says, "What are you doing, Sam? You only touched gloves in the last round." He says, "Yeah, for you, son, this is the last round."
Exactly. Yeah. Why are you touching gloves? This isn't the last round. No, it is for you.
And I told that the year Lennox Lewis got inducted into the Hall of Fame. And Lennox, it's great to see him laugh, but he laughed for a long, long time over that one. He said, "I wish I would have thought of that when I was fighting." You know, that would have been great to say to somebody. Because, you know, with Langford, there were so many stories where one reporter said he had a yellow streak, and then he knocks the guy out into the reporter's lap. And then one guy's cutting oranges, and he said, "From my fighter to stuck on between rounds." And
why are you cutting all those oranges? Oh, it's from my guy to suck between rounds. Oh, you're wasting your time. He's not going to need those oranges.
Yeah.
Took him out in the first, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And my favorite one was, aside from it, for you was the last round, was the one where they come in and discuss within the British officials. We appoint the referee. I bring my own referee. And they said, no, that's not. We bring our own. We appoint the referee. And he holds up his right hand, and goes, "That's my referee."
That's my referee. Exactly. Well, he was funny. He was witty. He had the mother wit.
Yeah.
And he took it very stoically, in such good humor. You know, when he went blind late, of course, you know, he was going blind the last several years of his career and had to get in close just so we could feel where the guy was, so we could clock him in the head or whatever. And that's just sad.
There's a video of him, though, which I'm sure you've seen, of him after the operations, where you could hear him talking, and it's rather it's interesting. Dempsey, right, admitted that he wouldn't fight him. He said, because someone said to Dempsey, "No one scared you," and he said, "That's not true. I was supposed to fight Langford, and I wouldn't fight him. He would have killed me." You know, Langford was
and at the time when he was under John the Barber Riesler, notorious. That was early in Dempsey's career, and that's when Riesler, you know, really kept insisting on putting him in with Langford, because he didn't care if Dempsey lost or not. He just wanted the money from the payday. Yeah. And there are some things people say that are a little bit hyperbolic. You know, they say it because they, for various reasons, they want to give the guy a lot of credit. They want to be humble. They understate things about themselves. So in my book, he may or may not actually have been afraid of Sam, but I'll tell you what, in my opinion, it would be pretty much pick 'em as to who would have won prime to prime. It would have been an awesome battle.
You know, the interesting thing is they talk about how Dempsey avoided Harry Wills. But if you look at Dempsey's career, he feasted on tall guys like Harry Wills. Guys like that, he just annihilated. So, for whatever,
I think he would have beaten Harry. It would have been a good fight. And Harry Wills obviously was a great fighter. Yeah. I think he was a little overrated in terms of his boxing skill. You'll hear about his boxing skill, and I can only judge by the few, you know, snippets of fights that remain with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, but of course that was really late in his career when he was knocked out by Oskudin. So I don't even really gauge by that. I've seen it, but him against like Luis Firpo and people like that, and he looks really crude. I scarcely seen him throw anything like a jab in that fight. He'll swing, he'll clutch, swing, clutch, and so I think he was a little overrated that way. But as long as he could hold you with one hand and hit with the other, and just mix them up to the body and head, and use some strategy and things. He was a really formidable guy to fight. And obviously his record against the other of the fearsome four and guys like
Langford.
Yeah, Fred Fulton. He looked really good. I mean, he had a great record against guys like that. Of course, Langford was aging and going blind.
Yeah.
But, I think he probably would have dominated him anyway, only because he was so large.
Yeah, so. I mean, Dempsey went through Fulton in 18 seconds, and it went through Carl Morris, who was despised, and Willard was easy and for him, and most of those big guys back then had no balance. Same as got a lot of big guys today, just no balance.
Exactly.
And Dempsey didn't have a problem with him. But Choynski fought guys like Frank Childs, who was a great fighter, and beat him. And Jack Johnson. Why was Choynski? Do you have a theory as to why Choynski wasn't affected with the disease of racism that other fighters were, like James J. Corbett and other guys back then?
Yeah. So I in my opinion, this goes back to his childhood, where his father, Isidore Nathan Choynski, I.N. Choynski, as he went by, was he's considered generally the most important Jewish writer of the Old West. And they go by how life was back then in the Jewish community, at least by his writings. Now, his famous antiquarian bookstore, which he opened on Geary Street, and at their house, I think this predated the Golden Gate Avenue house. In fact, I know it does. They would have what they would call back then a salon, a grouping of some of the best literary minds of the time. You had, of course, Samuel L. Clemens. You had Bret Hart. You had Bob Ingersoll. You had a lot of these guys, and they would chat. And Joe said that he would sit in and listen as a youth, and that he said he knew them all well. I don't know. I don't think he knew Mark Twain well at that time because, as it turns out, and I have Ron Power's book, Twain, awesome book. He said that Twain was actually out of the West just before Choynski was born. So I think he met him later, but memory. But he knew these guys, and there was an eclectic bunch. There were Christians and agnostics, atheists, and Jews, and just all different kinds of people. And of course, he also grew up in San Francisco, which in its own way was a completely different world from the gold rush on. You had people that would come in of all groups, and they all started on an even footing. The Jews weren't, there wasn't nearly so much bigotry against Jewish people, for instance, and blacks. They all came in, they all did their part in the community, and they were all accepted, not completely, but accepted to a much higher level than probably anywhere else in the country. Mm-hmm. And I think that environment and things like that, and the fact that there was Jew baiting going on in his case too. He had to put up with that. So I think, he was more sympathetic for that reason, but there was just a lot more of an eclectic environment where he was exposed to that.
Right.
And he was just a good person anyway. He was just a very good person. So I think when you combine all that explains it.
Yeah. And would you agree that, racism obviously stems from fear and ignorance, and he was not an ignorant person. As you said, he was very, very smart and very well read. So, that may have been another way that he could, almost like when you get a needle, I can't remember the word I'm looking for now, but inoculation against racism, in the sense that his intelligence, in that respect, stood him in good stead, that he realized everyone was equal to everyone else.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Obviously, he was very well read. He was into, he was very well read. I have some examples in my book of some of the books that he read, and some of the playwrights he followed. And he was just a very, very intelligent person. He was friends later, a good friend, and influenced somewhat by a man named Elbert Hubbard, who started an artisan community in upstate New York near Buffalo.
Famous community.
Yeah, and not to be confused with L. Ron Hubbard, who was an adopted nephew, not related by blood, and they only met, I think, briefly when L. Ron Hubbard was 5 years old. So they are not really to be associated. Elbert Hubbard was an interesting man. He ended up dying on the Lusitania after famously writing. He wrote, I need to mention this for the human interest part. He wrote in his writings, Elbert Hubbard, that how noble of Isidore, oh boy, I'm forgetting his name. Isidore Strauss. Isidore Strauss and his wife Ava, who owned Macy's in New York City. They were millionaires, right? They were on the Titanic in 1912. When she was offered a place on the boat, he said, or when he was offered a place on the boat, he said, "No, I'm not going. I want someone younger to take my place." His wife said, "I'm not going either. My husband's here and we're going to die together." And they did. They went in an upper berth and died. Well, so they went down with the Titanic, and a year or two later, shortly after, Hubbard wrote that how noble, and if I ever get the chance, that would be the way I would like to go, not knowing that he would get the chance. Wow. So on the Lusitania, which of course was, bombed by a U-boat off the shore of Ireland.
Yes,
it happened. And he said, he's saying to someone, they're like, "What are you going to do?" And, the boats had already departed, and some people are getting ready to jump off the edge when it's going under. And there was no hope. And Isidore and his wife said, Elbert Hubbard and his wife said something to the effect of, "It doesn't look like there's anything to do," very calmly, and said, "We're just going to stay together here." And they walked up to their room in an upper berth and just went in, and essentially that's the last that was seen of them too. So
wow,
yeah, that's courage.
I remember reading an autobiography of my favorite comedian, Groucho Marx, and he said the day after Lusitania was struck and sunk, that in the United States there was no such thing as German fried potatoes or sauerkraut or German chocolate cake or anything like that. It all disappeared. And that's a great slice of world history. That's one of the reasons why I really loved your book, because it's more than just a book about a fantastic fighter, Joe Choynski. It's a slice of American history, which is also a slice of world history. And I wanted to ask you why, for some reason, like recently I thought, well, he must have had a lot of fights and then gone to Australia. But when I checked your book again, he went to Australia after 8 or 9 pro fights. I mean, why would he go to Australia that early in his career? Just because he was young and wanted an adventure?
Yeah, that was part of it. He said that there were people in San Francisco, friends of his, who had been there, and who told him that it's just basically it's if not a life-changing experience, it's just a really good place to visit. And a lot going on there, and just something that you wouldn't want to miss out on if you get a chance. So yeah, in 1890, he did his Australian tour and knocked out guys like, Jim Jawbreaker Fogarty. Of course, he had the 2 fights with Joe Goddard, who was really in his short prime. What's that?
Goddard was a very dirty fighter, though.
Very tough, very dirty. And I'm actually friends with a descendant of his, a good guy, but very tough, very dirty. And Joe was only 21 at the time. They fought twice there. Both times he was stopped in the 4th round, but he was beating the living heck out of Goddard. He was pummeling him. He had him a bloody wreck. And the referee, this is Joe's side. So the referee, like in England a long time ago, would referee from outside the ring. Well, he said, like, I'd floor Goddard. The referee on the outside of the ring would run all the way around the ring before he started counting. And Goddard used this tactic where he would rush, because he was much heavier than Joe. And of course, most of them were. And Goddard was a pretty big heavyweight at the time, 6 feet, but he was over 200 pounds. And he would rush Joe against the ropes and double him over almost backward, trying to crush his spine, basically. And it took its toll. So Joe would be beating the out of him. And and then he would run out of gas because he was being pummeled and leaned on and rammed against the ropes and any number of things. And the referee would count. He claimed counted slow when he had Joe Goddard down. So yeah, he didn't escape with a couple of losses on his record there. So
he avenged the loss though eventually in the United States.
He did.
Right? He did beat Goddard.
Including that one.
Right.
He avenged that one. He avenged his loss to Peter Marr when Marr took him out in 6 rounds. After Joe was dominating rounds 5 and 6, and by most accounts had Marr on the verge of a knockout, and then he just walked into a right hand. And as we all know, as you know, I'm sure, about the only thing Marr could really do was punch, and he could punch. He was I liken him in a way to like in Ernie Shavers of the 1970s. Not a lot of stamina, not a lot of ability to take it, but boy, could he punch. So
it reminds me, Choynski, of a story Angelo told me, and the fight that you can see on video. Angelo's favorite fighter of his own fighters was little Louis Rodriguez from Cuba. And he was fighting Nino Benvenuti. And after 10 rounds, Louis ahead. And he looks up at Angelo and said, "I'm going to knock him out." And Angelo said, "No, you're not going to knock him out. He's 6'1". You're 5'7", 5'8". You're beating him. You've won every round on speed. Just jab and run. The idea is not to fight. It's to box." And Louis said, "I'll knock him out." And he said, "You won't. If you stand still, he'll knock you out for an hour and a half." And Louis goes out the next round, and they trade punches, and Benvenuti hits him, and Rodriguez is out. And on the way back to the dressing room, he says to Angelo, "I want to get him again." And Angelo just says, "Just be happy I'm not going to kill you," because you just had him in front of you. You had him in front of you for 11 rounds and you couldn't listen. What would you do different? I told you, run for 5 rounds and you're the world champion, but he wouldn't listen. And it seems like, Choynski had all those tremendous skills and great skill of anticipation, ring geography, and speed and mobility and foot speed, educated feet. And it's just what can you do against a guy like Goddard who's bigger, who physically grabs you and just treats you like a tackling dummy? And if the referee's not on your side, there's not much you can do.
And that brings up another point. One of the things Joe said about that Choynski said, was that the referee explained all these rules that were completely foreign to America that he wasn't ready for. Like, you can't use if the guy's charging you, you can't bring your shoulder down like Jim Corbett did a lot. You couldn't do that. You couldn't do this. You couldn't do that. You couldn't. And it handicapped him a lot. Right. So not to make excuses, but he didn't have the referee on his side. I mean, obviously he didn't have the crowd on his side, but he didn't have the ref on his side. He didn't have their interpretation of the rules on his side. He didn't have just a lot of things going for him. So when coupled together, all of it, it wasn't a fight he was probably going to win unless he took Goddard out in one shot. And a prime Goddard was particularly tough to stop. Later, I was going to say later, like most swarmers, or most guys like Joe Frazier, Rocky Marciano, Tom Sharkey, guys like this, they would have short primes because they're so fire and they're all flame and in intense action, and they wear themselves out over the course of time. So Goddard later was stopped by a lot of guys, but in his prime, he was a really tough fighter. Yeah,
a lot of guys, Arturo Gotti and guys like that, short shelf life, great exciting fighters, but you can't fight that way forever because it just takes it out of you. I wanted to ask you, how big would you think the rings were in Australia, or even in the States? Would this be a 20-foot ring or 18 or 15-foot ring?
So, originally, of course, Queensberry rules, they were supposed to be 24, and they evolved a lot since then. I'm trying to remember. I think that one might have been a 16-foot, which, of course, is the minimum normally. And that would have heavily favored Goddard because Choynski couldn't dance around and avoid him. He would be cornered and cut along the ropes a lot, which, of course, was the point, I think. And they geared everything in his favor in that fight. And that's why when Choynski got Goddard back in America, he told him before the fight, he said, "You don't have things your way this time." He said, "It's here." Basically, he says, "I'm going to kick your," and he did. He pounded him pretty good. He avenged a lot of losses like that, like against Peter Marr once he got you the second time, I guess maybe not to the extent of a Joe Louis, but once he got you in the ring the second time, you were in for it.
Yeah, you fought Joe Louis the second time, you're a dead man.
Yeah.
You know, when I was with Angelo Canastota one time, they had the ring that Ali and Frazier fought in 1971. And Angelo says, "Get in the ring." And I said, "You're not allowed in there. There's a sign." And he said, "There's no one here. Take your shoes off, get in the ring." So I get in the ring, and he said, "Just move to the center from the corner. Count the steps." It took me 3 steps. And he said, "Right. Can you imagine Muhammad had to deal with that for 15 rounds? Frazier took 2-3 steps at the most, and he was already on top of him." And
it was a small ring. Huh?
Yeah, and he said when Leonard fought Hagler, he was surprised because he went in with 2 things. He wanted a 12-round fight, not a 15, and he wanted a larger ring. And Hagler's handlers, the Petronelli, said, "We'll give you a 50-foot ring. Marvin's going to knock him out in under 60 seconds anyways." And Angelo said, as you mentioned before, hubris. It was hubris that took Hagler down because, his corner gave in to all that, and they shouldn't have done that. I want to ask you, with Corbett, did Choynski ever really become friends with Corbett? Were they good friends? Were they able to get over their earlier animosity?
Yes, they were very good friends late in their life. Now, of course, they had an on-again, off-again relationship. And coincidentally, one of their rather famous reunions, was in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where my in-laws live and where we visit a lot, and just a short distance from here. It was Hub City. So Corbett stopped in a train down on his way to New Orleans to fight John L. Sullivan. And when he did, it was all set up that Joe Choynski hadn't spoken to him in years. And of course, as a childhood, there was quite a bit of animosity from the battle on the barge and everything else. And so he got on the train and they had some words because Choynski had said something about punching him in the nose and vice versa. But when it came down to it, they shook hands. They had a few brief words like, "I can't believe you said this about me." And he said, it was taken out of context, or "I'm sorry," that sort of thing. Shook hands, made up, and had a nice conversation for a while until, Corbett had to go on his way. But so late in their career, Corbett would stop by in Walnut Hills, a community of Cincinnati, Ohio, where Choynski lived toward the end. I have a picture of I actually have several pictures of his final abode. And Corbett would get with him and they would have dinner. Them and their spouses would have dinner. And they were really good friends in the last multiplicity of years, I would say.
It's good to hear, because there's a great picture. You have a wonderful picture in your book of Choynski just before he passed away, sitting on his couch without a shirt. But you also have pictures of him with Tom Sharkey. And I guess Choynski was friends with Sharkey. Most people don't realize that boxing, for the most part, most fans don't realize, I mean, you do, but most fans don't, that it's not personal. For the most part, it's business. But
obviously there are exceptions.
Right.
Wilder and Fury, maybe there are exceptions where there's animosity, unfortunately. And that, of course, is because there's a gamut of personalities and individuals. But yeah, as you know, boxing usually foments or it builds respect, mutual respect. You share an experience in there that is just highly emotional, one-on-one. There's no one there but your cornerman between rounds. It's you, and it's potentially life and death. So you exchange a lot of, Joyce Carol Oates, put it very well in her book on boxing, but there's just so much you share in there that it's going to usually build, if not a lifetime of mutual friendship, respect, certainly. So, yeah.
You had that wonderful photo of Sharkey and Choynski at the racetrack. So they were friends at the end. Yeah, they were. I have to say that Tom Sharkey, in a lot of ways, was a sketchy individual as far as like the National Club, for instance, in San Francisco, Groom and Gibbs, the owners. And it looks like they were all in collusion of not choosing a referee for, I think it was for the Choynski fight. Right.
And because the rules said if you can't agree on a referee by a certain time, the club will appoint the referee. And it turned out that Tom, well, apparently anyway, was a member of that club. So he had a vested interest in it. So there were things like that. Sharkey wasn't always the nicest person. He was a very tough guy, but of course he developed a lifelong, very close friendship with Jim Jeffries, and he did. Choynski was forgiving, and Tom changed somewhat as he matured. So with all that said, they did end up becoming good friends in the last several years.
I read when I was researching something for my Substack, Once Upon a Time in the Prize Ring, about how when Sharkey fought Fitzsimmons, and Fitzsimmons, Wyatt Earp was the ref, and Sharkey claimed Fitzsimmons hit him low, which he didn't.
Right. No, it was a body shot. It was a legitimate knockout. Mm-hmm. I have D'Amato's book that is on nothing but that fight, and it's an awesome book. And I have, of course, a lot of stuff on that whole thing. And I can go off on all kinds of tangents on this, so keep me on point. But Wyatt Earp, it's basically been proven that was a crooked decision, and Wyatt Earp, going into the fight, knew he was going to award it to Tom Sharkey at the first opportunity.
Right.
Fitzsimmons was robbed 6 ways from Sunday in that fight.
And Sharkey's doctor admitted it years later and told him what to do.
Yeah.
And Now, the great Ray Arcel had a comment once. Someone asked him, is it true that Benny Leonard's fights were fixed? And apparently the only time they saw him get angry is he trained Arcel, or he trained Leonard. And he said, yes, but not in the way you believe fights are fixed. In other words, guys like Jack Johnson and Sam Langford and Leonard, and a lot of great fighters, had to agree, a lot of black fighters, Joe Gans, George Dixon, that they wouldn't destroy their opponent, that they let the fight last 7 or 8 rounds before they could actually get the metaphorical handcuffs off and start the fight.
I was just going to say handcuffs on. Yes. Yeah. They were handcuffed.
And how about Choynski? Did he have to agree to that before any of his fights?
He alludes to it that in a few of them, he did have to, but I don't think there was much of that going on with him. Because again, I don't think the anti-Semitism was too strong against him. There are instances, like he mentions in a letter. He said at one point, he says, and he doesn't allude to the exact incident that brought that up, but he does say in one of his letters, at least, and why do they keep using the term Jew boy? Why do they keep calling me Jew boy? And so there are a few things. And of course, Choynski also made light of it, and he humorously said something about going into politics, but I can't be found next to a pork barrel, things like that. So
that's very funny. Now you said he got a license as a chiropractor. He went to chiropractic. Yeah. Did he actually practice as a chiropractor?
He did a little bit. They said, where he had his shingle, hung, and I did. Again, I only found this out kind of by accident on a hunch. I emailed one of the chiropractic institutions, and James Winterstein, the president, ends up saying, that's not ours, but we absorbed, we're now a repository of all the records of all of these other ones we've swallowed up. And one of those was the Pittsburgh Chiropractic College that Joe graduated from. And I believe it was in 1918. I have it here. So, yeah. Yes. Around November 5, 1918, Joe began chiropractic school in Pittsburgh. That year, the Universal Chiropractic College, the UCC of Davenport, Iowa, merged with the Pittsburgh College of Chiropractic, becoming the UCC of Pittsburgh. He graduated May 5th, 1920 from the Universal Chiropractic College of Pittsburgh. And James Winterstein, I gave him a copy of the book after. He was, forthcoming and all of that. So that was fortuitous, because you can't find that anywhere else. In fact, he had no idea who he was. He's like, wow, I had no idea that one of our graduates, was a Hall of Fame legendary boxer. Yeah. So he thought it was really cool. And so I gave him a copy, and that was really interesting.
Go ahead, sir.
As far as in practicing, there's not really any record of his clients or anything, but that's kind of esoteric, so I'm not surprised. And he wasn't he wasn't successful in it for very long. He ended up going into things like he was a felt salesman, a salesman of different sorts. And obviously, for the most part, he was a boxing instructor at least apparently 3 different places, including in Chicago and in Illinois. So yeah, he was a boxing instructor under a lot of different in a lot of different institutions.
Well, did he manage to save any of the money from his career?
So they said that he was a rather frugal person. He wasn't ostentatious. He wasn't somebody who spent a lot of money. He wasn't a cheapskate either, but he had money until apparently the stock market crash of 1929, when I think he lost most of it. But it's not something he ever talked about.
Right.
Late in his career, there were things that alluded, and they had a few collections taken up for him here and there, and they asked him, but he was not the kind of person. He just wouldn't talk about it. He was very private, and that's part of the reason no one ever wrote a biography about him, is because he was just so reticent, and he just didn't talk about himself. He was a very private person. His wife was, and so yeah, he didn't self-promote a lot. Very humble guy.
You think he regretted not having kids?
Probably. And again, there's nothing, and that's one of the things I've always wondered about. Why? I don't know. There's a whole different and very interesting story about Tommy Ryan in that respect that I won't really touch on here because I'm saving it, but unexpected. But in both cases, it's probably just a sad story of one of them couldn't, or something like that.
Right.
I think. I don't know. There's just no way to know. But they never had children. By the way, I'm very, very close friends with a sweet woman, Harriet Draper, who is like 95 now. I think she's 96. She's the last surviving member of the next generation after Joe Choynski. All of the other ones, and that was his younger brother, his youngest and younger brother, Edwin, who had 3 children. She's the last one remaining. And any of the ones, like Janet was Herbert's daughter, only child, and that was about it. And they're all dead. So Harriet's the last one. She's a very sweet lady. She and her husband, who's now dead, they gave me such a large quantity of the photos and the anecdotes and everything that you find in the book. They gave me a lot of information.
How did you find out about her?
Different ways online. So online, I found out about the other side of the family. So Herbert's daughter, Janet, ended up marrying one of the Fleischhackers, and the Fleischhackers are from money. They're very well to do. And I had been corresponding. So I found, oh boy, gosh, forgive me. 8 years ago, my mind was very sharp on all this, but, Mortimer Fleischhacker, the oldest. Right. So I got in touch with him. He had been writing a little about it, and he said, great. I'm glad we're talking. He was a very nice guy. He put me in touch with his younger brother, who had written a book on his own about, I think, the Peace Corps or something. And he had most of the family extant records and things like that. And he ended up profusely thanking me for the book after, saying, I was going to write like our family memoirs, but now I don't need to. Because, and it's a double-edged sword. I'll never again write an 800-page book.
Right.
Never. It was too long. But that said, no one will ever need to write another book about Joe Choynski, because I delved back into his dim ancestry as far back as you can go.
Right.
And it was fascinating to me, and things like that. And if you'd like, I can give a quick, background sketch on Joe's siblings.
Absolutely. That'd be wonderful.
So Herbert was the oldest, the firstborn, and he ended up being noted mostly for 2 things. He was a colonel in the Spanish-American War, and there are some brilliant pictures of him in uniform with his saber at his side and everything, and the chevrons and just the tassels and everything. And then he was known later as possibly at least on the short list of the best criminal defense attorneys in San Francisco in his day.
Wow.
So he was the colonel, but he was also a very noted attorney. He went after Abe Roof and a lot of noted criminals of the time. And then there was the only female born, his sister Miriam. And for instance, I'm trying to remember their names. Norton B. Stern. There's a couple of the most prominent writers for the Western States Jewish history. They had written the famous article "San Francisco's Fighting Jew" about Joe Choynski, and in it they got a couple things wrong. They're really good, but they got a couple things really wrong. They said Miriam had never married. Yeah, she did marry. She married a Gentile sea captain. Who was quite a character in himself, in his own right. And I have a few notes here on him. So I said, Miriam Choynski, born May 23rd, 1864. Noted through the years that she never married, but she wedded a Gentile mariner, Captain Henry G. Williams, in 1889 in Oakland. He piloted a steamship for the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. Miriam divorced him after about 6 months because he was abusive. He was very abusive, causing IN, her father, to ban her from the house, saying, "Never cross my portals. My daughter is lost to me." But she was welcomed back by her mom, by Harriet, after he passed. And she lived there until Harriet died, actually until she died. And she never married again. But it says, Williams, I noted Williams took $1,500 in jewels when they parted. He had three wives before he died, June 19th, 1901. In 1900, he was sentenced to 6 months in the county jail for beating his third wife, Amelia, because she dared to ride her bicycle without his permission. He allegedly tried to drown her in the bathtub, pulled her around the house by her hair, dislocated her fingers by bending them backward, hurled a kitchen clock at her and a lighted lamp, and beat her senseless. So he was quite the character. So not surprising she divorced him after 6 months.
Wow. Was Choynski close to his siblings?
Yeah, he was close to him. But when he moved away, he only got a chance to visit once in a while. The first one to move away, as I remember, was the next sibling.
Right.
So, give me just a moment on that one.
No problem. Yeah, he's just. You know what? One question I was thinking of when I was thinking about him last night, Chris, was I was thinking of Abe Attell, who was also from San Francisco. Is it possible to know if Attell ever met Choynski or came across him?
I would suspect he did. I don't have any record of that. Abe Attell was quite a fighter in his own right, and of course, after his career, he let's say engaged in some questionable things, including the White Sox scandal, or Black Sox scandal. Yeah, and I could go off on tangents of that because I'm actually a fan of Shoeless Joe Jackson, who, by the way, was born and raised here in Greenville, where I live.
Right.
And there are I visited his gravesite, and there are a lot of tributes to him, including his old home has been turned into a museum. So the next one was Maurice or Morris Asham. And that's the other thing that Kramer and Stern got wrong, is they said that Joe Choynski was 2 years older than Maurice. It's the other way around, actually. Maurice Asham Choynski, Asham after his mother. Asham was his mother's maiden name. Maurice Asham Choynski, born April 1st, 1866. In Chicago, he owned and operated several Nickelodeon motion picture theaters. In 1924, the San Francisco Bulletin referred to him as a Chicago movie magnate. He married Sarah Collins, a Catholic, in 1902, Allegheny, Pennsylvania. But he's most noted for opening the second Nickelodeon picture theater in Chicago's history, January 1st, 1906. He missed opening the first theater in Chicago history by 7 days.
Wow.
So he operated several theaters. So he was definitely a theater man.
I believe I heard his name once in Neil Gabler's book and movie, The Jews Who Invented Hollywood, and he was talking about Carl Laemmle and Louis B. Mayer. I almost said Meyer Lansky. Louis B. Mayer and Samuel Goldwyn and all these guys. And he mentioned how a lot of them, because they had to get patents, they had to get film from Edison, and from Edison's friends. Edison didn't like it. And so they said in Chicago and New York and other cities on the East Coast, Edison sent thugs to break up their movies sets and intimidate their stars until Carl Laemmle got the Jewish mafia involved. And so the next time Edison sent people, Jewish mafia,
surprise.
Yes, sent them all back, sent like 8 guys back in body bags, at which point Edison said, okay, that's enough.
That sounds about right. I do have some things about Morris when he was part of lawsuits that had to do with censorship or lack of censorship in Hollywood and rights as far as the kinetoscope and just things like that. So he was very involved in the whole thing from a logistical and a legal point of view. He was very tall and lanky, and
What to say that, yeah.
Joe, so he was like 6 feet tall. So was Herbert, and Joe was about maybe 5'11". Again, Harriet, who I'm friends with, her father. So her father, Edwin Walker Choynski, was only about 5'8". I have photos of him and Joe standing side by side, and there's like a 5-inch difference in height.
Wow.
Yeah. And Edwin, who again is the youngest, he was a member of the Olympic Athletic Club like Jim Corbett was for quite a while. And he boxed amateur. I have a great photo, again, that Harriet and Al Draper sent to me that I was able to use, where it shows him on the rooftop on Golden Gate Avenue on their house. There's a water, I had to crop it, but there's like a water tank that they got their water from just beside him. And he's his friend Walsh. The two of them are posing and they're sparring for the camera. And he looks just like Joe in that photo to me. Edwin resembled him a lot at that age, but yeah, he was only 5'8". And he worked on the Embarcadero, and he was more of a broker, investment broker kind of guy. So that was his thing.
I mean, it was clearly an accomplished family. I was wondering, why didn't Joe get a shot at the heavyweight title? Was it just a matter of timing?
Part of it was timing, because there were other fights that were already settled, like, Jeffries and Sharkey, the 25-rounder, that hellacious 25-rounder, legendary under heat lamps, which is wow. The Fitzsimmons fights involving Jeffries and Fitzsimmons and Corbett, and there were a lot of them, of course, a lot of back and forth. He, in my opinion, he deserved it after certain wins over like Peter Maher and some of his fights. He fought a draw against Sharkey that definitely should have been a win, or should have been a disqualification win for Joe. Later Sharkey knocked him out. What's that?
He beat a lot of good guys.
He did. He had really good results as a heavyweight.
Yeah.
So he definitely could have been given a shot at the heavyweight title.
Yeah. One thing I read, it said that on BoxRec, he beat Australian Jim Ryan August 29th, 1899, which you know about, in Dubuque, Iowa, to win the inaugural light heavyweight world title. Now, did he ever achieve wider recognition as that? Because they've been talking about a light heavyweight division for years by that time.
Yeah, and Lou Hausman, of course, was key.
Right.
The Chicago newspaper man for the Interocean, and a boxing promoter, and he just wore a lot of hats. Lou Hausman, of course, as you know, he's legendary too.
Right. He ran Travis Falls, and he also did the Gans McGovern fight.
Yeah, so he was a prominent figure, and he pretty much got the light heavyweight division started. And there were no less than 5 fights in which Joe Choynski was it was widely advertised in newspapers, like all over the country, that this is for the inaugural light heavyweight title. This is Joe now defending his light heavyweight title, and he defended it against several guys. So, in my opinion, and again, Herbert G. Goldman, who wrote I asked to write the foreword to the book because he was such a proponent of Joe Choynski, especially as the first light heavyweight champion. He put it well too, but it's probably just because the light heavyweight division was new. It wasn't as yet widely accepted, and even retroactively. So George Gardner, I guess, was the first one that was widely recognized as the light heavyweight champ. But Jack Root, Jack Root before him, retroactively, according to Goldman himself, who ran Ring magazine for a while and Boxing Illustrated, he says that he would walk in and talk to Nat Fleischer and guys like that, and he would lobby. Jack Root would lobby as being recognized as the first light heavyweight light heavyweight champ, and there is some truth in that. He probably deserved to be. In fact, in my opinion, he definitely deserved to be recognized as such. But Kid McCoy maybe after him too. But in my book, absolutely, it's well documented, and it's ridiculous that Joe Choynski is not officially and widely recognized as the first light heavyweight champ, because he was.
Yeah, I agree, without a doubt. Factually, doesn't matter what a person's opinion at that point is. Your facts pointed out he was the first heavyweight champion of the world. You can't argue with fact. Yeah,
because he beat internationally known light heavyweight champs like of Australia, right, top guys who had good credentials, and he beat so many of them. It's like, after defending it 5 times, how can you still not recognize him as the champion?
That's one of the
so I don't think he got a fair shake.
You're right, and I agree, and that's one of the beautiful things about your book. You take Joe Choynski out of the 1800s and you bring him into today, and you make him alive, and you make him a real person. And to me, the book was, as I said to you before, was like having a friend. And the saddest thing is when you read the last page and you think, that's it? I could have kept reading it. This is my friend. I could have kept reading it forever. So
thank you for saying that.
It's I want to show people again. And the book is available on Amazon, right?
Yeah, it's on Amazon. Honestly, I like Barnes & Noble. You can certainly get it on Amazon.
Yeah.
I want to give a little shout out to Barnes & Noble too.
Okay.
You can absolutely get my book. I would mention you may want to get it soon, because there's going to be a little price hike on it just to keep up with the skyrocketing costs of publishing. Amazon now takes like 30% of your so there is that.
How far along are you in the Tommy Ryan book?
So I'm about, let me preface it by saying the second and final version will be much shorter. but right now I'm 500 pages in, and the first draft will probably go 775 pages, but the final draft will, again, air quotes, only be maybe 450 pages. So it's still going to be a large book, but I only tackle virgin soil. I would never write a book about someone who's already had a book done on him. Dempsey's and Lewis and Johnson and all those guys, no one ever did a book on Joe Choynski. I don't think anyone will ever need to again.
Right.
It won't be as ridiculously long as that one, but I think it's a good read nonetheless.
It's a brilliant read. It's an engrossing read. It's evocative. You laugh, you cry in it, but it's definitive. It's like when Ella Fitzgerald sings a song. There's no reason for anyone else to sing it after that. It's been done. It's the best. It's not only the best book, obviously, to anyone to write on Joe Choynski. It's the best book on any fighter from that era. You're not going to find a better one from any fighter in that era. But it's more than that. It's a slice of American history, and world history. So it's just a fantastic piece. And I look forward to your Tommy Ryan book. I just want to say one funny thing. When I sent my book's basically done, but when I sent it in, the person I sent it to said it's 1,200 pages, and I said I have 22 font because of my eyesight, and he said, "Oh, well, reformat it to 10 font, and then you'll get or 8 font." And I said, "Okay, that's fine. I'll use
Oh,
eyeglass." I said,
wow.
it's not really that long, but because my eyesight's not great, I have to have it very large so I can see what I'm doing."
Oh, he'll accept 8 font.
Yeah,
Wow,
that's
eight point. Oh my goodness. Wow, because my Choynski book was 11. I think generally standard might be 12, but I had to shrink mine
okay.
down too. I had to shrink mine down too.
Yeah, just a small font I can't see. I can't see what's on the computer.
I'm with you. I'd have a hard time with that one maybe. My end notes are 9 because I wanted them small. You know, they're not as
right.
Well, not everyone's going to read those. And those ran about 35 pages, by the way. That's how much. That's how many. And I just want to mention too that with Joe Choynski, I had collected. I always do the collecting phase first. It'll take maybe 6 months at least, or a year. I had collected about 9,000 newspaper articles for Joe Choynski, and I've collected close to 16,000 for Tommy Ryan. So that's part of the reason it takes so long. You just have to go through so much material, and you try to get as much of it firsthand eyewitness or primary source as you can, of course.
Yeah,
you only use the innuendo and the rumor and the legend after to maybe put in some points.
I wanted to do a book on George Dixon, so I gathered all this evidence. And a friend of mine who'd moved here from the States was working on a book about Dixon, and he got us out. I helped him with it, but I was so concerned with info when I started to write it, but I started it too late. So I may just pivot and do a book on George Byers because I know some of George Byers' relatives that are still alive.
Oh, wow.
That I've spoken to. But I also spoken to one of Dixon's great grandnephews, worked as a school teacher with my sister. And
oh, wow.
So he had interesting information. And also the interesting fighter from that era who Choynski beat was George Godfrey. He was originally from Prince Edward Island. And what was interesting about George Godfrey was Godfrey, when he was in Boston, he bought land. And he died at the age of 40, I think, from tuberculosis. But he said to his family, never sell the land. Just allow people to build on it and rent stuff out, but never sell it. And to this day, his family still has millions of dollars because they never.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they kept.
Of course,
and I don't know any other fighter from then who was able to do that.
Exactly. It was rare. He talked to Peter Jackson, the great Black Prince, and he told him, "You need to save money for a rainy day." Mm-hmm. And Peter didn't, and of course he died of tuberculosis, but he also died penniless. So he invested really well in around Boston. George Godfrey, he was quite the. They said he had a beautiful piano in his house, and it was just well furnished, and he was just a very respectable gentleman with a nice family and a lot of good property and such. Yeah.
I want to say thank you. I could talk to you for the next 25 hours, but
Great.
You have a family, so I know you can't. But thank you so much. You're a mensch, and it's wonderful to see you. And I want to mention again, this is a fantastic book. Go to Barnes & Noble. You can go here in Canada to Chapters Indigo. If they don't have it in the store, you can order it, Chapters Indigo, online. You can go to Amazon and order it. This is a fantastic book. If you call yourself a boxing book collector and you don't have this, then you're not a boxing book collector. This is a magnificent book, and from first page to last page, it's absolutely a wonderful read. And we will look with bated breath in anticipation for Chris's next book on Tommy Ryan, who's has to be, Chris, you'd have to say he's one of the greatest fighters ever to set foot on this earth of all time.
Yeah. I definitely think he was, and I want to thank you so much, Lou, for the kind words. I also want to mention a couple things real quick, if I may.
Yes, absolutely.
One, of course, is that you have a book coming out very shortly, your first book, and I definitely am going to get a copy of that.
Yes, thank you. Boxing's greatest controversies, blunders, blood feuds, and bad decisions.
That sounds like a great read.
So it's from.
And by the way, speaking of Ray Arcel, you portrayed Ray Arcel in the movie The Cinderella Man, correct?
Yes, and
I saw you in that.
Oh, thank you. Angelo said that's kind of interesting. Ray was 5'9", 5'10", 120 pounds, and you're what, 5'8", 200 and. But it's interesting. Ray Arcel was a very nice guy, and I mean, Angelo was just like a father to me. But and of course, that movie was a fictionalized version of his life because, as you know, Max Baer was a nice guy. He was not
exactly. They made him out to be a villain, unfortunately,
and he wasn't. You know, when he killed Jack Campbell, who was the brother
Frankie
of
Campbell.
Frankie Campbell, thank you. Who was the brother of Dolph Camilli of the Dodgers, as you know. He supported Campbell's wife and kids for the rest of his life. And he didn't kill Ernie Schaff because I took the medical records and I gave it to my cousin, who's a doctor, and he said, it's not possible to give a person brain damage and then have Schaff fight 4 more fights and then die. He said,
it was a love tap from Primo Carnera, as I remember, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't even that. Yeah. My cousin looked at the autopsy. He said he died of spinal meningitis. He would have died whether he went in the ring or not at that time. And rather than go to a hospital because he had a bad case of the flu, he went to a religious retreat. He didn't believe in medicine. And so when they did the autopsy, after I mentioned this in the book, they find out that he had spinal meningitis. But of course, back then, there's no way they could have tested for it until he died. And Carnera couldn't hit hard enough to bust an egg. So, yeah, it was just a sad story. But Jimmy Cannon, who was a great writer, and a lot of other great writers, Damon Runyon, said that it was Baer that killed him, and Baer didn't kill him. And Baer felt terrible about that. And of course, Baer died young at 50 of a heart attack. And a lot of guys like Joe Louis were heartbroken because although he beat Baer, he loved him. And Baer had the single funniest line I've ever heard in boxing. They asked him to define fear, and he said, fear is standing across the ring from Joe Louis and knowing that he wants to go home early.
Yep. Another thing Baer said, so they claim, is about when he was about to die, he was having a heart attack. He called down to the desk at the motel, and he was asked, "Do you want us to send a house doctor?" The house doctor, he said, "No, people doctor, please."
Yes. And there was a story about after that's a true story. Angelo told me, and he said when after Lewis knocked him down 3 or 4 times, he goes back to the corner, and his trainer Ansel Hoffman said, "You're doing great. He hasn't laid a glove on you." And he said, "Well, then keep your eye on the referee, buddy, because somebody's kicking the crap
beating the hell out." That's awesome.
He's just a wonderful character. And just to let you know, because I think the Choynski Chronicles needs to be made into a movie. This is a movie waiting to happen. That on Cinderella Man, I said to Ron Howard, there's so many wonderful stories like this, like Jim Braddock, but there's even better stories in boxing history going back, 50, 100 years that could be turned into movies that are so heartwarming and that not only encompass boxing, but encompass everything, family values, encompass everything that would make people want to go watch it. And
I agree.
And and certainly the Choynski Chronicles is just one of those books. Just magnificent.
Well, Lou, if you have any connections in Hollywood, please press the issue with them for me.
I'll do what I can. I'll do what I can. As long as I get a free popcorn, that's all I care about.
Oh, and then some.
Thank you so much, Chris.
You're welcome.
You, and wish you well, and look forward to the other book. And as we normally do, we'll keep in touch on a weekly basis anyways.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for this, Lou. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone watching enjoyed it too. And yeah, everyone watching enjoyed it. Absolutely loved it. So thank you so much, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.